I graduated from Berklee College of Music in 1995 with a degree in music performance as an electric bass player. So when I graduated, I had this impossible dream of one day performing on Broadway, which in and of itself is a little strange because at the time I'd never even been to a Broadway show. I'd never seen the stage live. But I knew that it was this prestigious gig that paid really well, and when you're unemployed and living at mom's house, that's pretty much what you're looking for. So at the time, there was no internet, and I needed to figure out who was actually performing on Broadway because I figured if they have the gig, maybe they can tell me how I can get the gig. So there was no checking up online, connecting with them on Facebook, searching them on Google. I actually had to go into the city every night, dressed up, go to each of the theaters, and steal a playbill. Playbill was the program, and in the program was a list of all the musicians that were performing in that show. So I would come in every night, wait outside, see if I can catch somebody on a cigarette break, or talk to one of the ushers, make friends with the person behind the ticket booth, and convince somebody to give me a playbill, and then I move on to the next show. After about a week or two, I had collected 10, 15, 20 playbills from all the shows that were on Broadway at the time. So now I have this list of all the musicians that were playing in the shows. Now I have to figure out how to contact them. So in order to perform on Broadway, you have to be a member of the union, Local 802 in New York City. And when you join the union, they give you a book that has a directory of all the people that are in the union. So you figure it out. Like if you have to, in order to have the gig, you have to be in the union. If you're in the union, you're in the book. So now I have to join the union so I can get the book. So now I know how to contact everybody. So I truck into the city, sit down at the, fill out my application at the union. They find out that I don't have a show. I just want to join. I don't have a show. I don't have an opportunity for a show. And apparently at the time you needed to be in the union to have a show, and you needed to have a show in order to be in the union. So there's this weird vicious circle that left me leaving there empty-handed, not a member of the union, wouldn't let me join. So I go home, next day I come back into the city, take the bus in, and at the bus station I bring a wire cutter with me, and I stole a phone book that was chained to a phone booth in the bus station. Because I figured if you're performing on Broadway, you probably live in New York, and so you're probably in the phone book. And I was probably right about 50 or 60% of the time because I got a good portion of the people on my list. I had gotten their names, their phone numbers, and addresses from that phone book. And so I did what any rational person would do. I just started calling them. And nobody was very helpful at the time. So I was told I was too young. I was told I wasn't good enough. They didn't even know who I was. Nobody ever called me back. So I started packaging up demo tapes and resumes because that's what musicians want, is they want to listen to somebody else's demo tape and read their resume. But I figured it was worth a shot, and so I would send it out and didn't hear back from anybody. So I started playing a game with myself, and I would start collecting no's. And what I would do is I'd wake up in the morning and I had to collect 15 no's for that day. And couldn't move on with the rest of my day until I collected those 15 no's. And what that did was that created this barrier where I didn't feel the rejection as hard because every time somebody told me no, it just brought me closer to being able to get on with my day. And so I'd pick up the phone and I'd start calling, and I'd ask them, hey, I wanted to meet with them for lunch. I wanted to sit down with them. I wanted to pick their brain. I wanted to sub their show. I wanted to do something. And again, you're not good enough. You're too young. You're not experienced enough, and I'd hear all the rejection over and over again. And eventually, I figured somebody would have to say yes or give me some glimmer of hope, and that day actually did come after a while. After about a week or two of making these phone calls, after a week or two of sitting in the fetal position from just the enormous amount of rejection, a guy named John had not said no. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He was a musical director for several shows on Broadway at the time, and he had told me that I can't help you unless you're a member of the union. So once you join the union, call me back and I'll give you some advice. So I got on the phone with him, I ran into the city again, and I went to join the union. Only this time I had a reason. Now I didn't have the show, I didn't have any show, but I had instruction from a musical director who told me to join the union, and that's all I needed. I told that to the people behind the counter. They let me fill out my application, probably thinking that I had one of his shows or who knows. And I left there with my card-carrying member, as a card-carrying member of Local 802, and my directory of all the people that were on Broadway. And so got home, called him back, all excited, gave him my local 802 member number, and he told me that I was completely wasting my time. That was his advice. You're wasting your time. Calling musical directors, calling drummers, calling trombone players and guitarists and pianists was a waste of your time. I was an electric bass player. I should be calling the other bass players and looking to them to hire me to sub for their show. And that's where my time was best spent, and so that's what I did. Packaged up all my letters and my resumes and my tapes, and I sent them out, and I started calling and started following up with them, and sure enough, I got the same thing. You're too young, inexperienced, you're not well connected, not good enough, all that kind of stuff, all the rejection over and over again. Only this time, there was only about 12 to 15 people to reject me, because there were only about 12 or 15 bass players from shows that I had wanted. So I did what any, I decided to take a look at this from a different angle. And what I did was I reached out to everybody with this idea that these are musicians. There's a level of interest in being significant as a musician. And so I called everybody back and I told them that I was writing an article for Bass Player Magazine. Now, Bass Player Magazine was the big magazine at the time for bass players. And what I told them was I was writing an article about how to perform on Broadway, how to become a musician that had a gig on Broadway. And of course, everybody was interested. But there were a couple of catches to it. If you wanted to be in the article, you had to let me watch the show from the pit. You had to introduce me to all the musicians on Broadway. You had to give me an hour of your time to interview you, and you had to give me a copy of the music. And every single one of them was fine with that, and they signed up. And and over the next couple of weeks, I spent hours at each show. I spent meeting all the musicians, finding out what it would take. And of course, my interview was all based around how does a guy like me get a show like this? And I got all the answers. I collected all this information. I had all the music. I had everything I needed to know to get on Broadway. And so I started practicing and studying and doing what I had to do. And about a month or two later, I started getting the phone calls. Hey, where's the article? How come the article's not out yet? The problem was there was no article. I had told them that in an effort to get their attention and to sit down with them. And now I have all this information. I have the ability to write an article, but I don't have an article. So I did. So I got on the phone and I called Bass Player Magazine and I said, hey, I got this. I got all these friends who work on Broadway, and I'd love to tell you, write an article about what it takes to perform on Broadway. And I got all, I can get all their interviews, and I have all this information, and they loved the idea, and so they paid me $400 for this article. It appeared on the front page, on the front cover of the magazine a couple months later, and somehow I had turned into a published author of articles for this magazine while trying to accomplish this gig. A couple months later, when the article did come out in the magazine, I sent everybody a copy of it with a little sticky note that said, hey, here's the article, would love to sub for your show. So I created this thing where I was giving to them, but I was also taking. It wasn't this selfless act. There was clearly a strategy behind it. And as a result, I got, you guessed it, you're too young, too inexperienced, not good enough, and now we don't like you because you tried to fool us. And except there was one guy, and his name was Steve, and he was like really enthusiastic about this article. So I offered to take him out to dinner. I figured if I corner him in person, I have a better shot at getting the gig. And we went out to dinner, and we were talking about the article, and he was really, really excited about it. And as it ends up, his father was a bass player too. And his father was a bass player during the 60s when he was a studio musician when they didn't really keep track of who played on what album. There were no liner notes inside albums that said who the musicians were. He was just a side musician. And he had played with some of the best, Jim Croce, Bob Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel, like some of the biggest artists at the time, some of the biggest albums at the time. And and he was the guy. And yet he died completely unknown. Nobody had ever even heard of him because back in those days, they just didn't celebrate the side musicians like as they do now. And what this article had created for this guy was he was now immortalized in this magazine And because of that, he wasn't going to die the same fate as his father, having never been known. And so it was really meaningful to him. So we got into this conversation. Before you know it, I'm offering him to write an article about his dad, which was entitled The Most Famous Bass Player You've Never Heard Of. And then I pitched that article, and that article came out. And this time when the article came out, I sent it to him, but there was no sticky note. There was none of this. There wasn't this idea that I was going to give to him in return, he was going to give to me. It was just a selfless act. Here's this article. And it was a good feeling. I just let it die there. I just gave it to him and let him enjoy that article about his dad. His dad now didn't die unknown. People knew who he was, and it was an amazing experience. A couple months later, he reached out and he wanted to know if I was interested in subbing the show. I didn't ask, I didn't beg him, I didn't bother him, I didn't chase after him. He just wanted to know if I'd be interested in subbing the show, which of course I said yes. I hadn't given up on this dream. I was still pursuing it, but just not as aggressively and not as selfishly as I was before. And so sure enough, he gave me 2 or 3 months notice, and I started practicing. And I would run the show every single day, twice a day in my bedroom. I'd have flashlights shining in my eyes. I would play the show by knocking the music over and seeing if I could recover. I put the music out of order to see if I would be able to figure out how to get through the show with the music out of order. I would be in the car. The only thing I would allow myself to listen to was that show, and I would sing the bass line the entire time. I mean, I immersed myself into this to a point where every weekend I would go and I would sit and watch him play the show for the matinee, and then he and the rest of the band would go out to dinner. And while they were at dinner, I would sit in the pit in his chair, and I would play the show with my headphones on. Then he would come back and I'd watch the show and watch the evening show. And this would happen every Saturday and Sunday. For months I went through this. So by the time that it was my chance to play the show, I had done it 100 times. I had played it over and over again. I'd seen the standing ovation. I had seen every single song. I had seen the lights. I had seen the experience in my head hundreds of times. So it was just one more time that I had to do it, and I killed it. And so when I left the theater, threw all my stuff in the car, and I sat in the front seat of my car in front of the theater for 20 minutes just bawling, just uncontrollably bawling, because not just because I had accomplished this great thing that I had on my list, but because I was convinced that this thing was impossible, and somehow I had done it. Somehow I had taken and done this impossible thing that got me thinking, like, what about all the other things that I never even tried because I thought they were impossible, that I just gave up on, that I just let go of. I mean, we all have this impossible goal, these impossible dreams, these impossible things that we want to accomplish that we don't even try because they're impossible. This was one of them, and it wasn't impossible. And so how many more times did that happen? Have I turned away something just because I didn't think I had a chance? And so I was bawling at the idea of, like, oh my God, look what I have done. And so I got home, and by the time I had gotten home, there was a message on my voicemail from the bass player that had hired me to sub the gig. And apparently he had gotten a call from the musical director, and because I was so prepared, because I was so confident, because I had been through it so many times, for the first time ever playing that show, I had nailed it so and done such a good job that it was requested that I would become the first call sub. And so now I became the guy that got the call every single time when he couldn't make it. And after a year, I was playing the show full time on the road. Within 2 years after that, I was back in New York playing the show. And it all started because I had this thing that I didn't think was possible. So my question to you is, what's your Broadway? What's that thing that you want so bad that you could just feel it right here, but that you don't even try because you don't think it's possible?